Hey guys, tonight we're slipping away from the clamor of the day and into a shadowy grove where ivy curls around marble pillars and the scent of overripe grapes hangs in the warm air. The sky bleeds lavender and gold, and beneath a lazy canopy of vines, you find someone lounging on a leopard skin hammock. He's barefoot, wearing something between a toga and a bedsheet, crowned with wilting grape leaves, and swirling a goblet of wine with theatrical disinterest. This is Dionysus, god of bacchanals, of wine, and, as will become clear almost immediately, of theater. And yes, he's bored. Deathlessly bored, in fact, because apparently even as a deity, chugging ambrosial cabernet ad infinitum gets kind of old. You're going to trail behind him into a groovy, bizarre odyssey that starts with too much wine and concludes with Greek theater, city festivals, epic tragedies, and more drama than your 8th grade play audition will amount to in historical footnotes. Spoiler alert. You'd likely wouldn't survive beyond 2 days in Dionysus's initial parties, but tonight, you got a much more leisurely task ahead of you. Close your eyes, get cozy under the blankets, and read along at your own sluggish tempo. So, while getting cozy, take a second to like this video and subscribe. I mean, only if what I'm doing here is your kind of thing. Also, post your city and local time in the comments. I love watching how far around time zones this slow-moving procession travels. Now, let's dim the lights, perhaps flick on a fan for that gentle background hum, and get started gently into tonight's journey. You move gingerly over broken tiles, over to where Dionysus is reclining. The marble is chilly underfoot, sticky globules of grape skin littering the floor from yet another not exactly divine banquet. Satyrs sprawl around him, holding tambourines and half-filled goblets, their goat legs half hidden under them in dramatically bad postures. Dionysus hardly glances up. He breathes, one great big dramatic breath, the sort that'd be seen in high school drama clubs and ancient temples. Grapes again, growls Linus. Always. This is the bit no one puts in the mythologies. Of course, you're familiar with Dionysus, god of frenzy and inebriation, wild man of the Olympians, god whose parties were so rowdy that he needed to develop entire sacraments as an excuse. But no one ever tells what happens after the 3-day wine binge at breakfast. Or after 5,000. Spoiler, hangovers and existential fear. That's where you'll find him, divine, dramatic, and intensely restless. The wine is no longer thrilling. The devotees? Well meant, of course, but with each offering of fermented goat milk or yet another homemade wreath of laurel leaves, it becomes increasingly obvious. There's a missing. He notices the activity around him. A group of maenads struggle to pull a tree into artistic submission. One of the satyrs attempts to play 2 pan flutes at once with poor success. Some guy Theophrastus is reciting a limerick about olives at utmost vocal effort. Again, you keep step behind Dionysus as he stands up. He begrudgingly, with a breath that might melt sphinxes to ashes, and goes to roam around the grove. The leopard walks beside him, its tail lashing against your leg every so often. Eventually, you notice. He's not merely distressed about the party. He's disillusioned in his job description. Sure, Dionysus wasn't exactly cast as the god of wine, it kind of evolved. Originally, he was a fertility god, more associated with harvest and humid, pulsing life force than just chardonnays on the veranda. The wine came later, and it was great. But the more people drank, the less they noticed the story behind the wine. Worse, they stopped feeling. And feeling intensely, that was Dionysus's whole thing. He was the god of extremes, of dissolving boundaries between self and other, mortal and divine, tear your robes open and dance on the mountain kind of expression. And now he was just background noise at a toga party. Perhaps, he remarks as he strolls, they require something fresh. Something more than about joy, though, about catharsis. He stops. Something in which they can laugh and cry without being trampled beneath donkey feet. This unsettled speculation drifts into the vegetation above like incense smoke. You don't really get it then. But later, as dusty Athenians come to sit in white stone theaters under the Acropolis, you will recall this moment. The moment in which a god had this idea, what if people all came together, and simply watched a narrative? Stone cold sober, radically, if it's possible. It's still controversial among historians whether Dionysus meant to invent theater, or whether it was a sort of galactic coincidence. Too many dance masks that whirled out of control into narrative-structured plots. But one thing's pretty clear, he was looking for something. Not applause, but depth. content in plays, even meaning. Back at the grove, Dionysus came to a halt. He tilts his goblet and spills out the wine onto the ground. Small violet flowers erupt out of the earth around his feet, an omen that he's not angry, merely anxious to move on to something new. Maybe wine came as a prelude. Perhaps the greatest headline show was yet to come. You trail after Dionysus along a path cloaked in mist, seated among olive orchards, summer air heavy with dew and late summer quiet. He walks barefoot, of course, and the ground appears to hum wherever his bare feet strike it, as if the ground itself still remembers who he is. He speaks as he moves, primarily to himself. That is what happens to gods. They forget that you exist, or perhaps they remember and simply find small talk among humans reassuring, as humming to a plant. Forgetfulness gives his voice a flip, carefree intonation, theatrical feeling infuses it. Did I ever tell you, he starts, readjusting his grapevine crown, that I wasn't meant to be here at all? He waves his hand indistinctly towards the mountains, the sky, the rust-flemmed clouds. Truly, mere dramatic chants of thunder and thigh. Wait, thigh. According to Dionysus, whose telling of it is, in fact, far too long of an improv bit, he has perhaps the most explosive birth of anyone at Olympus. His mom, Semele, a Theban mortal, made the big G error of requesting a meeting with Zeus in his unaltered state. Behind that chiseled chin and stern toga, Zeus is, in short, a conscious supernova, and as soon as she saw him in mortal sight, she incinerated herself in a bolt of lightning and irony. Zeus, now with a very inflammable baby in mid-delivery, thought to himself that the only reasonable thing to do was stitch the fetus into his thigh, for safekeeping. Yeah, his thigh. Historians still argue whether this motherless thigh birth imagery was symbolic or just peak mythological absurdity. But mythographers agree on this. Dionysus wasn't born like the other gods. He was stitched together from tragedy and improvisation. Divine Plan B, with a flair for the dramatic built right in. And maybe that's how you can feel that he already gets that human yearning for meaning in the midst of chaos. His life is a metaphor enriched with paradox, half human, half god, joy and insanity, wine and tears, creation out of destruction. You get to a secluded hill where it gets windy, rustling cypress limbs and old rumors. Here, Dionysus came up in a kind of witness protection. Having made such a tumultuous entry, Zeus recognized that Hera, his infamously not cool wife, might seek to do away with the illicit divine infant out of sheer wife spite. So Dionysus spent his childhood in hiding. Nymphs in the Lydian mountains and Phrygian forests became his caretakers. They played little reed flutes, draped him in protective spells, and taught him the basics of being a minor deity with major emotional range. One of them, a goat-legged nursemaid named Macri, apparently had a talent for lullabies that still echo in sacred groves. It is told that he grew up among beasts and trees that murmured sonnets. That he learned river language. That he wept violet tears when alone. The nymphs indulged his dramatic fancy, not because they believed that one day he'd devise live theater, but simply because they liked it quiet while he staged productions with rocks and sticks. You sit beside him as he tells this, all growing up in darkness and isolation, always balancing mortality and myth. You brush a bug away from your leg. It's lonely, he whispers, tossing a rock down a hill. Being adored, not comprehended. And this, right here, is the earliest ghost of future theater, the idea that the sacred and the human aren't so different after all. That pain, when performed, becomes connection. That suffering, safely observed, turns into communal healing. Of course, teenage Dionysus hadn't yet experienced that group of words. At this age, he primarily desired to be seen by the great gods and not killed by bolt of lightning or poisonous figure. But even in his quiet childhood scenes, though, you'll suspect that he learned one vital thing. It is a better world when danced. Most of his early followers were misfits, wanderers, outcasts, people shunned by mainstream worship. Women, in particular, who in Dionysus's secret rites experienced a freedom of sorts. And in stark contrast to other gods, he made no calls for great hymns, bloody offerings. He desired your raw emotion, tears, laughter, screams, euphoria. All of it, at once. One historian called Dionysus's spirit a walking contradiction in ivy, and he totally rocked that in a tote. Everybody else, he whispers, plucking at a fig, wants to be worshipped. I crave witness. You could get as close as a divine manifesto this evening. You lie back and watch the sky ripple with faint auroras. Remnants of old lightning, maybe, or just embarrassment from the gods above as Dionysus spills their tea. Somewhere in the distance, a satyr tries to play a harp with his feet. Dionysus doesn't even blink. This has always been his world: madness, majesty, and melancholy. And you, fortunate sleeper, are finally getting that backstage pass. It's still gold and blue by the time Dionysus brings you to what looks like, yet again, a forest. However, it's more subdued. Less frantic than that previous mythic grove, more orchestrated. Moss covers the ground like an avid decorator beat you there, and birds sing at judiciously spaced moments, in case even nature has read the playbook. This, says Dionysus, is where much of his teenage life was spent. In seclusion. It seems that Hera did not react too well to the whole "my husband spawned a wine god in his thigh" situation. Shocked, in fact. And so, little Dionysus was passed back and forth in realms like a hot divine potato. His early life was a tour of the Mediterranean, not in leisure, mind you, but in safety, from fertile Nyssa to exotic Phrygia, Lydia, and even India. You learn a lot when you're fleeing from divine wrath, he says, bounding over a root as if it personally insulted him. Things like camouflage tricks, how to ferment date wine in a short period of time, and how not to take orders from a goat that gives them to you. Don't trust a goat. You laugh as you move through rich underbrush, and it occurs to you, Dionysus was not only a god of wine, he was a god of survival. His childhood was one constant escape room with ritual masks in place of puzzles. It had been here, however, among nurses of nature, and particularly among nymphs and satyrs, that early seeds of his theatrical obsession had been so sown. Having been a childhood outcast, Dionysus learned early performance was power. Act like anything else, and your days live again. Get them laughing, and they feed you. Get them in tears, and they sing your name as if you're part of their narrative. Everyone is talking about masks at my festivals, he complains while berry picking. But I wore one. Scholars also refer to this period as Dionysus's hidden years. Exactly what transpired is far from agreed upon, not surprising, as this was a god of contradictions, but much of it shows him apprentice ing abroad. In Phrygia, he allegedly learned music and frenzied dances under veteran earth priestesses who shed tears of salt water and giggles. In Egypt, his supposed activity included interring a golden snake beneath the sand as tribute to shape-shifting. In India, at least as per Hellenistic authorities, who were, of course, prone to invention, he allegedly planted olive groves and stage directions. Those bits, he says, are a little bit dramatized. You rest beneath a fig tree as he sits beside you, eyes scanning the leaves like they're stage curtains. From his stories emerges a pattern. Wherever he wandered, he left behind not just the vine and the vintage, but rhythm, ritual, and dramatic retelling. This, you now see, was no normal deity pursuing wine fumes and tambourine solos. Dionysus was collecting a toolbox. An artistic survival kit. Storytelling was how he slipped through danger. 1 minute, he was a disguised mortal youth, the next, a lion, an old man playing a flute. Transfigurations weren't tricks of divine party magic, but of performance. A means of entry into feelings. If he could be them, whomever they were, then he could be comprehended by them. This could be partly why Greek theater would later rely so much on masks. Not so much for theatrics or sound, although both of those, too, it helps with, but because of transformation. You could become a different person by donning a mask. A better one, a different idea. The satyrs, ever his chaotic companions, were learning mouthfuls too. Less concerned with legacy, more with timpani and flotation, they still absorbed Dionysus's love for roleplay. They began consciously mimicking the gods, acting out tales they'd heard. Their improvisational mischief started developing form, and characters. Characters that were half goat, half narrative structure. Story requires absurdity, he remarks, as a satyr plows backwards into a puddle in great operatic style. It must also contain heartbreak. Otherwise it's mere religion. Even in the wild, even in secrecy, Dionysus was orchestrating something powerful. His group of outcasts did not simply drink and dance, they performed. They recited myths, clumsily, noisily. They made myths out of improv, stories of love out of salacious limerick. And yet, people came to watch. Something odd started to occur in the observers. They felt. They responded. Some who witnessed the performance felt restored. others inspired, a few puzzled, but undeniably curious. It was early, yes. Still messy. Still wild. Still decades away from when Athens would take taxpayer dollars to fund playwright competitions. But that notion, that seeing someone play at humanity could extract something out of your being, began to take root. One of Dionysus's nymph friends, Callianira, or maybe Dercetus, as told locally, told a human at one show, when we act as gods, we get more human. When we act as humans, we perceive the gods more clearly. Pretty good work by a group of inebriated forest performers. You gaze at Dionysus as he closes his eyes in front of you, humming a lullaby sung by grandmas in Anatolia, funeral hymns recited in comedic verse. He alternates back and forth in seriousness and flippancy like a boy in a rope swing, never fully committing to either. Sometime later, he rises. We're almost to the part where someone accidentally invents theater, he says cryptically, brushing moss off that eternal toga. You stretch your legs and follow, already half numb from the stillness but oddly lighter in your chest, all this divine performance business starting to echo your own days. The masks you've worn, the roles you've played. Somewhere in the background, a fresh laugh cuts through the trees. Someone's ad-libbing again, and you realize, the audience is growing. You hike behind Dionysus along a rugged path scooped out of a rock ridge, clumps of lavender that brush against your legs. The air has a taste of mineral water and fermented figs, a combination that in theory would be intolerable, but that here, with birds singing and faraway drumming answering back, counts as a refresher. Your heels grind into grape skins. Again, Dionysus glances over his shoulder, his expression conspiratorial, as though to confide in you in a sacred joke. So, he remarks, let us talk about how I originated wine, and how promptly I did grow weary of it. He gestures, and there is a small vineyard surrounding you, an affectation. Vines cover aged trellises, laden with rich, midnight purple grapes. But rather than being tended by priests or farmers, the vines exist almost as though they are aware of being in the spotlight. Wine will suffice, whispers Dionysus, popping a grape into his mouth. It unlocks enthusiasm, awakens song, eliminates poor verse. After the 900th mead-infused chorus line, even I started to crave a bit, richness. Nevertheless, to his credit, it is learned that Dionysus came to immortality without knowing how to ferment anything. That emerged later, and, strangely, by trial and error, using goat hooves, oak barrels, and charred with lightning raisins. You settle atop a warm boulder as he tells the story of how wine first arrived on mortal lips. In the beginning, it was sacred, a mysteriously sweet transformation of grapes, left too long in a clay jug and accidentally fermented into giddy delight. People thought it was magic. Spoiler, it kind of was. Assuming that Dionysus just so happened to like that batch. Once he'd gotten the formula down, he distributed it without restriction. Greece, Lydia, Phrygia, even exotic India, if your source. The itinerant caravan, part roadshow, part bizarre theological sect, dispensed wine in golden cups, danced in city gates, and hosted such wild parties that villages would collectively join him simply in order to forget taxes and pains of childbirth for a day. But what's interesting here is that wine was not meant to be ultimately aimed at. That was simply the prelude. A divine icebreaker. The drink was never the main event, it was what the drink unleashed. And what it brought out, time and time again, was emotion. Courageous, drunken euphoria. Unshakable bravery. Tears. Shrieks. Unbridled confessions. Folks relived lost loves. Forgave troublesome dads. Created poignant poetry that they'd immediately forget. Wine, as you know, stated Dionysus, raising his cup, strips away the skin of one's soul. It does not, however, reveal how it became bitter in the first place. For a while, even he was moved by how completely his followers let go. Maenads and mortals, satyrs and shepherds, all letting down their armor in the name of song and frenzy. The rites centered around him became increasingly theatrical. Tambourines were added. Scripts were joked about. Rituals blurred into routines. We historians are told that Dionysiac performances were among the oldest known forms of ordered communal performance. Not whole theater yet, but not totally run-of-the-mill spiritual behavior either. They did not merely dance and drink. They danced and drank with narratives. They danced in wearable animal hides, in antelope headdresses, in painted faces. They danced myths, inventing made-on-the-spot epics that dissolved into howling, clapping, crying. You can picture it now, night glade full of smoke, hillside alight with music, and Dionysus at its core, not laughing, though, but looking intently. I saw things, he says to me, that weren't delusions due to wine. Actual suffering. Actual purgation. They needed no ecstasy. They needed narrative. The sacred drunk became the divine director. Apparently, there was a particular time, not so much in writing, of course, when Dionysus stopped drinking at his own party. Just set the goblet down and began to take notice of faces instead. Paying attention to how one listened when one tended to speak out of passion, how one laughed at something absurd and cried moments later because of it. Not all individuals need a drink, he says. But every person needs a narrative. Certain peripheral folklorists suggest that Dionysus's slow withdrawal from wine was a subdued, second transformation, and resurrection less flashy than his flashy birth by Thai, though more significant in the long term. He stopped wanting to make people wild. He started wanting to make them whole. It was then, he says, that experiments commenced. The wine rituals became more elaborate, but less about the drink, more about the tale. The masks became more expressive. Songs added verses with tragic tension, dramatic art call response hymns shifted into full-character monologues. And suddenly, someone was doing a satirical reenactment of the pantheon's least family-friendly argument. You pause before a vine slope as Dionysus stops, looking out over a world that he made, myth by myth, vine by vine. They would laugh and I'd assume that they're laughing because they're inebriated, he whispers. Now, perhaps it was that the wine simply made them a better listener. It's a slippery idea that you keep in your pocket till later. Scholars to this very day quarrel as to whether later Dionysiac rites immediately spawned a festival of Dionysia at Athens, a civic festival wherein whole cities close up shop just to sit and witness tragedies and comedies beneath the bare heavens. Some claim such a link as being at best symbolic. Others demand a line of spiritual ancestry. What is known, Dionysus and theater became inseparable. Not because it was seeking attention, but because it knew precisely what it felt like to need compassion. Which is, of course, the best kind of director. You squint down the hill, where somewhere, centuries away, a stage is forming. The grapevines murmur their approval. Somewhere in between the foot of the hill and the swaying torchlight of a camp not too distant, you notice that the cadence of your feet has matched up with far-off drum beats. They're slow and steady, as in, like a heartbeat, but slightly off so that it makes you feel dizzy. Dionysus sees that too. He smirks. Ah, he remarks, they've begun without us. Again. You're in the world of his vagabond cult now, a group of joyous mystics, misfits, party intruders, and performance artists centuries before performance art existed. They leave trails across kingdoms, behind them perplexed farmers, cheeses that are oversalted, and a spreading impulse to join them instead of send them away. When you ride up over the last rise and look down into the shallow basin below, you see the party in full swing, maybe a dozen fires going, masks hung from cypress trees, people singing, people in mid-improvisational monologue. One guy is sobbing over a tambourine as two women attempt to dance out the Iliad with dramatic eyebrow action. Strange? Absolutely. But that energy is just right. Welcome to this grand Dionysian cult spectacle show, part ecstatic ritual, part immersive theater, always loosely unscripted. You've arrived in time for Act 1. It looks at first glance like a party. The wine is flowing, of course, but then there's this structure. Not your usual dinner party kind of agenda, but there's something under the fray. A beat. Loosely divided by function, the retinue members take part in days-long rites of song, dance, role-playing, and oral narrative, in Dionysus's permissive guidance. There are the maenads, women in flowing gowns, hair entwined in ivy, dancing till they weep. Satyrs, understandably coarse, assume a role in low humor. If there is a chorus, masked faces reciting moral aphorisms in chorus, booming in macabre across the grove. Do you see? Dionysus breathes beside you. They're not performing anymore. They're becoming. It is difficult now to distinguish in what manner theater stops and religion takes over. Scholarly historians confirm that Dionysiac rites merged priest and performer in indistinction. Some archaeologists believe such itinerant rites sowed the seeds of tragedy, not as performance, but as religious discharge. Ecstatic performance was the therapy session of the ancient world. And this therapy involved animal masks, borderline inappropriate flute solos, and full-body sobbing in public, followed by wine and dried fruit. You're led to a circle of stones as someone puts in your hands a crown of laurel. No crowds, no roles, just roles to be played. Someone invites you to perform the lamenting brother in a myth that you don't even remember. But as soon as you lift up your voice to speak, it happens. Something ancient. Something, right. One part of you is scared to death that you'll screw it up. Another part of you simply says, "That's the idea." Dionysus doesn't care about slick productions. His theater is sloppy and raw. When you forget your lines, that's when your real story kicks in. This is where traditional Greek theater began to take shape, not in polished marble amphitheaters under dignified silence, but in places like this. Lush forests flickering with torchlight, makeshift stages carved out of dirt, emotions louder than orchestras. You glance at Dionysus. He's looking at the people, not proudly, but out of curiosity. The way someone might attempt to understand that machine that he invented. Pain is more fascinating than perfection, he states nonchalantly, chewing the olive pit. And being vulnerable is the only thing that mortals always manage to get right. There's laughter from the center stage. Someone's pantomiming Zeus losing his sandals in a cloud storm. Moments later, the mood shifts. A Maenad collapses, weeping into the fold of her dress, and another begins to sing. A soft, wordless tune that sounds like someone grieving a memory not fully their own. You feel the ache right behind your sternum. Dionysus moves in close and whispers, "Just so, catharsis." The Greeks would later formalize that word, catharsis, meaning cleansing or purification. Specifically, the relief felt after emotional release. Modern scholars trace this concept to Aristotle, who later analyzed tragedy as a structured way to purge pity and fear. But long before Aristotle penned a sentence, Dionysus was in witness to humans waving tambourines, screaming into space, and hugging later. And perhaps that's sufficient analysis. He referred to it as the dance of feeling all the things, although someone doubtless translated that more poetically later. One fringe source, dubiously attributed but sweetly prolix, supposedly tells that Dionysus at one point interrupted his rites to demand of his followers, "Why are we pretending that these myths aren't about us?" And performance, allegedly, thenceforward became confession. Tonight, you see it firsthand. A farmer gives an ad-lib soliloquy regarding missing his crop. A widow gives a personal recitation of Persephone's account. A boy gets his arms painted in gold paint and pretends to be Apollo, then dramatically moves back away from the light because of everything's too bright for introverts. The forest echoes back in kind. By night 3, you don't recall who anyone really is. And it doesn't matter. Here, mythology and reality have traded places, and both wear very, very comfortably. When the fire dies and people drift away to sleepiness or hush or late-night poetry, Dionysus remains awake. He's drawing out a circle in the earth with his foot. Circles. A stage, perhaps. Arches. You couldn't be sure. Stories, he remarks, gazing up at the stars, are what are left after all else is wine stains. You nod, not knowing if he's addressing you or the moon. Either way, he's right. By the time the sun gets through the olive trees again, still warm and nonchalant as ever, Dionysus is pacing. Sleep is not exactly his cup of tea. He is the god who lies romantically asleep at sunset after too much rosewater, then wakes up at midnight because he came up with a better ending to one of his myths no one ever commissioned him to write. This morning his toga is awry, a bit of fig leaf adhering to his heel, and he is grumbling about emotion as structure. You follow him into a clearing that remains littered with wine cups and sporadic melted laurel crowns. But it's not like that today. The air has been cleared out, of more than just hangover songs and dance floor frenzy, of more than the idea that last night meant anything. "I'd like to attempt something," states Dionysus, who picks up a wineskin that was under a heap of reeds and gets to work as a drum. Not ritual. Not religion. Simple repeated action with attention. You're getting it. Theater did not descend upon us like a bolt of divine lightning. It assembled. Constructed scene by scene, branch of oak by shake of tambourine. Out of such night-long experiments Dionysus continually refined. He did not proclaim, "I will create the dramatic arc." No, he simply posed himself, again and again. How can they feel everything, and live to tell about it? So this time, it's him who sets it up. He gets his cult, Satyrs, women in ivy wreaths, gangly humans still rising, who hand out assignments. No script, nothing in writing. But this time, there's a storyline. The storyline, simply a recreation of his life: birth, exile, rediscovery, wine, regret, and reinvention. A half of them wrongfully assume it's a harvest metaphor. The other half believes it's a sentimental interlude. They both are wrong, and gladly so. You are among them, sporting a mask roughed out of a slab of bark and linen cord. Lopsided, itchy, ideal. Dionysus announces a tiny elevation in the clearing. Today, it's a stage. You don't hear him utter that term, though, in so many words, because somehow the movement of his fingers mapping out space around him indicates that he's creating it in his head. Then he starts. No grand prologue. Just feeling. A soft narrative wave. He grieves his unknown mother, his voice crackly, as if he's only now getting around to discussing her. He teases about hiding in tree trunks. He chuckles in mid-statement, because one of the Satyrs has a smear of cosmetics in the shape of Zeus. And then, without warning, he breaks up in tears while reliving the scene of him first pouring wine into the ground. There's no applause. Nothing but silence. And something delicate suspended in space, like pre-dawn mist after sad tidings. Your whole audience is mesmerized. A person in front of you breaks down and cries. One of the Satyrs sneezes, but gently, as if even his sinuses are impressed. The next player enters. They become him, Dionysus again in the robe, new mask. And you sit back and watch as his narrative spreads out in circles, narrated by others. Repeating and distorted, reflected, reinterpreted. Same roles pass by different people. One moment you play his nursemaid, assuring him that he'll be fine. The next, you're Dionysus in person, clipped of godhood, relating a variant of your own life. In myth, you could be anybody. And it still works. This, naturally, is his real innovation. Not the masks. Not the movement. But this one, ostensibly minuscule, question posed to your very essence. What will happen if I reveal your truth in my tragedy? These early shows, historians think, constituted mimetic theater, performance as empathy machine. Not simply seeing feelings, but shifting them. It is remarked by one archaeologist that pre-imperial Dionysiac cults performed their rites not in front of temples, but in front of each other. A deliberately human-centric orientation. The sacred wasn't out there in space, it was across from you, maybe keening into their propped goat horn. And though Dionysus never speaks of fourth wall, the imagined line of separation between audience and performer, you see today that it breaks down of its own accord. Onlookers become actors. Sad figures become laughter. A satyr breaks in character to inquire of whether his brother ever been proud of him, and nobody corrects him. The myth spreads and reshapes. One inscribes the performance of the day onto a wax tablet. Another draws the design of the masks in the ground. Pieces and parts committed to memory, not to document them, but to reproduce them later, differentially, with more anguish or jokes. One of the followers, a former shepherd called Thunderous, goes up to Dionysus in a cautious manner. Quiet voice, half an eyebrow missing, and never having spoken in public before. But after that day's performance, he declares, I remembered something I hadn't grieved. No answer. Just a nod. That should be enough. Just like that, theater begins to stick. You stroll with Dionysus afterwards along a ridge, the world below golden with dusk. He is stroking the stubble of his chin as if he is concocting a philosophy but not yet prepared to commit it to paper. What if he did this, he asks out loud, on purpose. He's not discussing cult dances now, or feasting rites. He speaks of deliberate, ordered narrative, characters, story, arc, sorrow, relief. That's risky, he remarks after a pause. Imagine folks gazing out of curiosity. No wine needed. They'd have to feel soberly. Terrifying, revolutionary, and, for better or worse, human. You reach the edge of the grove, where two trees naturally form a kind of curtain. He halts. Theater waits behind it. The trees part without wind. You enter a steep, narrow plateau that is in shadow, and time stands still. Not uncomfortably still, only a pause, as if the world is catching its breath. Dionysus will let you go through him first. Go ahead, he whispers, they'll start without you anyway. At your feet, a crowd has assembled. Not your average suspects of forest dwellers. No, these are townspeople, merchants, coin counters, shepherds, bronzomiths, fastidious individuals from the closest polis, called to this place by rumor of this new sort of festival. One that includes no grain offerings, no sacrificial cacophony. One that involves tales. And more, a platform. Not stage, not quite, not yet. But a scooped patch of ground, defined with rushes and chalk. A few willow baskets of figs, a jug of wine, left alone. And to one side, a goat, chewing contentedly at what is clearly not a prop but might be. It is no longer a ritual. It's the prototype of performance. Dionysus stands back and lets the momentum carry itself, the performers now moving not in spirals or ecstatic frenzy, but in something close to sequence. This time, the story isn't about him. It's about Pentheus, the ill-fated king torn apart by his own mother for mocking Dionysus's followers. A brutal myth, yes, but wrapped here in masks, brooding drums, and delayed reveal. There's tension where there once was only motion. Dialogue where there used to be chance. Now, in response, the story needs attention, not simply reaction. A woman speaks by herself in the background, her mask of rough bark, stained with white clay. She cautions the king in low, level cadences. You fear the wild because it smells like you. An old man nearby shivers. Even the goat gazes upwards. Dionysus is posed in front of a tree stump, arms crossed. It was never about wine, as such, he breathes. It was about getting people to cry over things that they already knew, but had forgot. You observe them switch places. This time, silently. They found out about pacing. Long breaks leave a mark. So does holding back. Shouting is not always necessary. Scholarship to this day disagrees about how long it would have taken initial cult performances to blossom into full plays. Decades. Generations. But in scripts, in pottery, in vanishing inscriptions, there is a single fact that emerges. It was theater much before people came out. The goat, by the way, is important. No, really. Later scholars would note that the word tragedy possibly derives from tragoidia, literally, goat song. Maybe because a goat was offered as a prize to the best playwright. Maybe because goats were often the featured costume. Or maybe, just maybe, because goats have an unholy scream that feels both dramatic and deeply ancient. You gaze at the goat once more. It regards you as though it is sitting on a secret. Two men speak by the platform. One of them betrays the other. You assume at first it has to do with crops and rights to land, until at the end of speech, in a sentence loaded with double meaning, he says, to fence a field is to name its ghost. A lady in your ear whispers, it's about love. Another, no, it's politics. And just like that, interpretation is born. Dionysus beams. This, he says softly, is what it's always been for. Not to tell a truth, but to unfold one. So slowly and strangely that the audience doesn't notice they're being rewritten. Then there's the chorus. Not sporadically, as that tambourine troupe of last week had been, but in unison. A wall of masked figures unfolding like a collapsible fan, compact, deliberate. The words of their refrain are spoken in meter. You don't hear every word, but the cadence moves through you like water up a reed. One French scholar theorized that these early Dionysian performances moved people not because of content alone, but because the form, this coherence in chaos, was itself a divine sensation. Order-shaped sound, reflecting a world too unpredictable to tame outside the stage. In today's performance, the tragic twist lands hard. The king dies, classic, and the actors fall still. No applause. Just quiet. And then, slowly, the audience disperses without comment, like the myth slipped down into their bones and needs to ferment overnight. Dionysus breathes out, slow and, they'll come back, he says. They always do. Centuries later, audiences will pay to watch reenactments of this exact scene. In marble theaters with ticket tokens, shaded by canvas sails, seated by social class and citizenship status. But right now, it all begins here. A dirt stage, a goat, a particularly talented bark mask delivery, and a god who's finally found something worthy of attention beyond wine. He leads you out of the clearing, barely containing his glee. They've learned not to flinch, he mutters half to himself. Now, we teach them to remember. And far behind, there is a chorus in rehearsal.